Hey guys, tonight we're about to witness a spectacle more stressful than a group chat with your ex, your landlord and your boss. Welcome to the world of medieval marriage, where true love was optional, teeth were negotiable, and a honeymoon was just the week after you survived the in-laws. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what absurd hour it is for you. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and make yourself as comfortable as you can, preferably somewhere no one is going to ask you if you've settled down yet. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to get married in medieval Europe? Did people actually marry for love, or just for land and livestock? How bad was the wedding night really? Did medieval brides wear white, or just whatever wasn't covered in goat hair? Could you actually say no, or did your parents do that part for you? Did anyone get cold feet, or were their feet just permanently cold? Was divorce even possible? Or did you have to fake your own death and move 2 villages over? How did anyone survive the in-laws, let alone the food poisoning? And what happened if you accidentally married your cousin again? Well, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1352 and you're engaged. The whole village is gossiping, your parents are negotiating your dowry in turnips, and you have absolutely no idea what's coming next. In medieval Europe, falling in love before marriage was about as likely as finding a gluten-free baguette. Your parents, or sometimes a total stranger with a feather in his hat, picked your future spouse for you. The negotiation sounded more like a livestock trade than a romance novel, and if you hoped for a say in the matter, well, good luck shouting over your mother's dowry checklist. Let's set the scene. You wake up one morning, stretch your creaky limbs, and before you can even rinse your face with yesterday's rainwater, your mother is whispering excitedly about opportunities. This is never good news. In medieval Europe, opportunity usually means you're about to lose something valuable, like your freedom, your privacy, or your last name. Marriage wasn't about hearts and flowers. It was about alliances, survival, and making sure your parents didn't have to support you forever. Love was something that, if you were lucky, showed up a few years later, somewhere between child number 3 and your joint case of chronic scurvy. But first, negotiations. These weren't delicate, candlelit conversations. Picture 2 parents arguing over your future spouse while you stand nearby, pretending to be invisible, and secretly hoping you're at least not being traded for a particularly ugly goat. Dowries and bride prices were debated with the intensity of medieval markets, because that's exactly what it was. Your worth was tallied in cows, sacks of grain, a rusty plough, and that nice wool cloak your grandmother made. No one asked about your feelings, your interests, or whether you could even stand the sight of the intended partner. If they could hold a pitchfork and didn't already have the plague, that was considered a win. Ever wonder what courtship looked like? Forget dinner and a movie, it's more like, here's a man with most of his teeth and a plot of turnips, and if you squint he only smells slightly like onions. Romantic, right? You might get a glimpse of your future spouse across the village square, or maybe you catch a muffled greeting while hauling water from the well. Actual conversations. Risky. Courtship was mostly done through parents, matchmakers, and, if you were very unlucky, the local priest who thought he was a cupid with a receding hairline. Once the arrangement was agreed upon, it was basically a done deal. In fact, betrothal was so binding that breaking it could result in lawsuits, feuds, and enough neighbourly gossip to keep the village busy for a decade. Sometimes a priest was called in to make it official with a solemn ceremony. Other times a simple handshake and a few muttered blessings did the trick. No matter how it was sealed, once your fate was set, you were officially off the medieval market. If you were rich or noble, things got even more complicated and sometimes even less romantic. Arranged marriages among the upper crust were about property, titles, and avoiding war with your neighbours. Picture being 13 years old and finding out you're now engaged to the Earl of Somewhere Cold and Windy because your father desperately wants access to his sheep. Your personal preferences are not on the agenda. If you're a peasant, at least you have a fighting chance of marrying someone from the next village, even if they snore like a blacksmith and chew with their mouth open. And what if you actually liked the person? Well, congratulations. That was considered an unexpected bonus, like finding an extra egg in the chicken coop. If not, you learned the medieval skill of polite endurance. After all, marriage was seen as work, a partnership designed to survive bad harvests, plagues, and the daily grind of medieval misery. The best you could hope for was that your partner was competent, moderately hygienic, and not already related to you, at least not too closely. So the next time you watch a romantic comedy, remember, in medieval Europe, your love story probably would have been decided over a wooden table, a couple of tankards of weak ale, and the ever-present possibility that you might have to marry your neighbour's cousin for the sake of peace, land, or a really nice goose. Now that's what you call settling down. Forget diamonds. The real sparkle in medieval marriage was the dowry, a slightly damp chest of linens, 3 wobbly goats, and whatever coins hadn't already been eaten by rats. The haggling over this fortune was so intense you'd think everyone was fighting for the last chicken leg at Christmas. Let's paint the scene. You're sitting awkwardly on a 3-legged stool in your parents' cottage, while both families gather for the great bargaining. On one side, your father, polishing his best argument and his only pair of shoes. On the other, your future in-laws, ready to fight tooth and nail for every last grain sack. The tension in the air is thicker than yesterday's porridge. This isn't just about marrying you off. It's about setting the tone for your entire adult life. Your value is counted in livestock and linen, not love poems or promises. It's like being sold at auction, except you get to keep the mother-in-law. Dowries were the currency of marriage, and everyone had an opinion. The list of gifts swapped hands, each item examined for hidden holes, suspicious smells, or previous ownership by someone who died of something contagious. Maybe there's a newish cooking pot in the mix still sporting last month's stew, or a bundle of wool that's slightly less matted than the family dog. No detail is too small to haggle over. These turnips are a bit soft, but they're very large. That goat limps, but she gives almost a full cup of milk if you sing to her. The linens have some moth holes, but that just makes them breathable. And let's be honest, no one trusts anyone. Every claim is met with squinting suspicion. How old is this cow? 3 years. Then why does she have teeth like the village blacksmith? There's always an uncle who steps in with wild stories about the time someone accepted a chicken as a dowry, only to discover it was actually just a plump pigeon. It's less negotiation and more Olympic-level bluffing. Meanwhile, you, the so-called happy couple, sit quietly, wondering if anyone will notice if you slip outside for some fresh air, or at least a break from the turnip fumes. But no, your fate is tied to the outcome of the world's slowest, least glamorous auction. If you're lucky, your parents have squirreled away a few silver coins for the occasion, maybe a special jug or a basket of apples. If you're unlucky, the big ticket item is a patched-up blanket and the promise that your family's pig only bites on Wednesdays. Sometimes, negotiations last for hours, sometimes days. If things get heated, everyone takes a break to glare at each other across the yard and gossip about who's winning. There's always the looming threat of a walkout. Someone declares, "This is outrageous," and storms out, only to return 10 minutes later for another round because, let's face it, no one wants to start over with a new family. In rare cases, a neutral third party, usually a priest or the local wise woman, steps in to mediate, armed with stories of how things used to be much worse. If you're part of a wealthier family, the stakes are even higher. Now we're talking about actual land, maybe a chest of tarnished silver spoons, or a rare imported cloth that everyone pretends is silk. The drama is enough to fuel a whole year of village gossip, and if someone tries to cheat, say, passing off a goat as young when she's clearly old enough to remember the last comet, rest assured the shame will last generations, and when it's all finally settled, a handshake, a meal, and the careful counting of all promised goods. If something is missing on wedding day, congratulations, you just kicked off a family feud. You might still end up married, but every family gathering will feature at least one pointed comment about that goat, or the missing turnips. So next time you hear about wedding gifts gone wrong, just remember, at least nobody today is trying to trade you for a sack of root vegetables and a goat with attitude. In the Middle Ages, that was a fairy tale ending. Getting engaged in the Middle Ages wasn't just a quick ring selfie. Betrothal was a binding contract, and breaking it could cause family feuds so dramatic they'd make your group chat look peaceful. Some betrothals lasted for years, giving you plenty of time to regret everything. So let's set the mood. Your parents have just finalised the dowry negotiations, the goat is still glaring at you, and now the two families gather for the official announcement. Forget popping the question at sunset. Here, your engagement is sealed with a handshake, a few solemn words, and possibly a small audience of neighbours who came for the free bread. If you're lucky, someone offers a toast. If you're unlucky, someone offers advice. Betrothal in medieval Europe was less hearts and flowers and more legal paperwork and public pressure. The local priest, who's already memorised everyone's business, is usually on hand to bless the arrangement and write your names in a record book that doubles as the village's juiciest gossip log. Sometimes there's even a formal ceremony, involving the joining of hands, exchange tokens, and the uncomfortable realisation that your fate is now public property. Hope you didn't have a secret crush on the baker's apprentice, because it's officially too late. But here's the catch. This engagement is basically a mini-marriage. If you change your mind, you can't just call things off and hope it blows over. The entire village knows you're promised. Breaking a betrothal can spark a feud between families so intense, even the cows pick sides. There are legal consequences too. Promised goods may have to be returned, reputations are ruined, and suddenly everyone's talking about that one time old Jeff's daughter left her fiancé and ran off with a wandering minstrel. Spoiler. It never ends well for the minstrel. And yet betrothals could drag on. Maybe you're both too young to marry right away. Maybe someone has to finish their apprenticeship or wait for a relative to recover from the plague. It was a common scheduling conflict. Sometimes parents keep the engagement going for years just to make sure both families keep their promises, or to wait out a particularly stubborn harvest. You'd think that all this waiting would give you time to get to know your future spouse. In reality, most of the time is spent apart, each family making sure you don't get too friendly before the actual wedding. Chaperones are everywhere. Letters, if you can write, are read aloud by parents. If you do manage to sneak a meeting in the woods, you'd better hope the local gossip is napping. Otherwise, half the village will know by sundown. During the betrothal, both families are on their best or worst behaviour. Every interaction is under a microscope. Your future in-laws visit for dinner, politely ignoring the dog chewing on a shoe in the corner. Every word is carefully chosen, and every laugh is slightly forced. Your mother is already calling your fiancé son or daughter, while your father reminds you, loudly and often, how much is riding on this union. There's pressure to be polite, pressure to be productive, and pressure not to accidentally insult your in-laws with the wrong turn of phrase. Medieval small talk is an Olympic sport, and as the months or years pass, the stakes only get higher. Did your family promise too much in the dowry? Are the goats looking skinnier than they did last year? Has your intended's hairline started retreating like the French during a bad campaign? Every little issue becomes an opportunity for drama. Betrothal isn't just an engagement. It's a season of reality television. Only everyone's wearing mud-stained tunics. Finally, when the big day is in sight, the sense of relief is real. You survive the world's longest engagement, endless negotiations, public scrutiny, and 1,000 opportunities for scandal. If nothing else, at least you're now a certified expert in medieval patience, and possibly sheep bartering. So next time someone complains about a 2-year engagement, just remember, in the Middle Ages you could be waiting a lifetime, and by the end you'd know everyone's secrets, including that goat's. If you thought your awkward teen years were bad, imagine being married off before your voice finished changing. Medieval marriages often happened as soon as you were of age, which could mean 13 if the grain harvest was good and nobody needed more time to grow a moustache. Let's time travel to your 14th birthday. Your face is a battlefield of hopeful peach fuzz. Your knees are covered in permanent mud stains, and suddenly your parents declare, "Congratulations, you're ready for marriage." There's no talk of gap years, study abroad, or even finishing your chores first. The only requirement is that you look old enough to survive a cold winter, and possibly carry a bucket of water without falling in. In fact, being of age was less about emotional maturity and more about basic survival skills. For boys, it meant you could lift a bale of hay without dropping it. For girls, it meant you could carry a jug on your head, knead bread, and not accidentally set the house on fire with the hearth. If you could do those things, congratulations, you are now qualified to be a spouse, and probably a parent within the next year or two. Puberty wasn't something anyone had the luxury to hide from. If you were a noble, your wedding was scheduled as soon as the family astrologer said the stars looked less disastrous. If you were a peasant, it was all about the harvest cycle. Busy in spring? Wait until after planting. Plague year? Maybe push it back to after the funerals. If the local lord needed a labourer or another alliance, well, too bad. You're getting married before your next voice crack. Let's talk about the ceremony. Forget the idea of a young couple nervously sneaking glances at each other down the aisle. Most of the time, you'd barely met your intended before the engagement was arranged. If you were lucky, you'd spoken a few sentences and maybe exchanged a nervous smile over the communal soup. If not, you might be introduced on the morning of the wedding itself, with your mother whispering last-minute advice about always looking busy and never mentioning the family's goat incident. From a modern perspective, it all sounds horrifying. But for medieval families, marrying young was a way of securing alliances and making sure the next generation arrived before the parents were too old to help raise the kids. Life expectancy was short. If you waited until your 30s, you'd be considered ancient and possibly a witch. Most parents were eager to see their children settled, producing grandchildren, and, let's be honest, moving out of the house, even if moving out only meant moving to the hut next door. For girls especially, marrying young was the norm. By 13 or 14, many girls were already considered marriageable, especially if the local birth rate had dipped and the parish priest was starting to worry about the village's reputation. Boys usually married a bit later, partly because someone had to be able to pay for all those goats and turnips, but not by much. A boy of 15 or 16 was practically an eligible bachelor. Puberty was less a phase and more of a public announcement. This one's ready to help churn butter and create heirs. Daily life for these newlyweds was anything but romantic. Most young couples moved in with extended family, sharing straw mattresses and household duties that made algebra homework look like a day at the spa. There was no honeymoon phase, unless you count waking up at dawn to milk a cow together, or learning to pretend you weren't completely terrified of your spouse. Teenage awkwardness reached new heights when you were both supposed to be adults, running a home while still occasionally crying because someone took your favourite wooden spoon. And yet, amid the chaos, some young couples figured it out. Eventually. Survival, after all, is a strong bonding experience. Maybe you learn to laugh at each other's first attempts at bread baking. Maybe you both marvel at your neighbour's mysterious rash and hope it's not catching. Over time, you grow up together, navigating adulthood before you've even finished outgrowing your childhood. So next time you cringe at an awkward school dance photo, remember, at least nobody forced you into a lifelong commitment before you finished growing your wisdom teeth. In medieval Europe, puberty wasn't a reason to hide. It was wedding season, whether you liked it or not. The medieval wedding dress code was simple. Wear whatever doesn't have a suspicious odour. White dresses. Too expensive. Most people got married in the cleanest tunic they owned, which was rarely that clean, and often borrowed from an older sibling who may or may not have survived their own wedding. Let's set the scene. It's your big day, and instead of a personal shopper or Pinterest board, your main fashion consultant is your mother, who's rummaging through a wooden chest with the frantic energy of someone trying to find a dry pair of socks before a rainstorm. Your options are limited. You can wear the brown tunic with the mysterious stain shaped like a duck, or the grey one with just a little hole in the armpit. Whichever you pick, it will definitely be itchy, and it will almost certainly come with a bonus patch or two from your great-aunt's sewing marathon. If you're a peasant, the idea of special wedding clothes is a fantasy. The best you can do is pick something that hasn't spent the last week doubling as a work smock. For most brides, the traditional wedding dress was whatever you hadn't already worn to muck out the animals that week. If you owned more than one outfit, you were basically medieval royalty. And as for grooms, let's just say there was a lot of tucking in, brushing off and hoping that mud was in fact just mud. Colour wasn't about symbolism or fashion. It was about whatever dye was cheapest at the market. Blue was nice, red was showy, but both were expensive, so most wedding attire ended up in shades best described as earthy, or hasn't been washed since Lent. If you were lucky, a neighbour might lend you a slightly newer cloak or a belt with only minor fraying. But remember, borrowing clothes in the Middle Ages came with its own risks. Lice, mysterious odours, or worst of all, the scorn of the owner when you inevitably spilled soup on it halfway through the feast. Accessories were, let's say, creative. Flowers might be woven into your hair if it was spring and the goats hadn't eaten them all. Some brides wore garlands made of herbs, which doubled as a medieval deodorant and a bug repellent. Veils, when they appeared, were mostly for the wealthy, or were really just an extra piece of cloth your mother tied on because it looked festive. Shoes were optional. If you owned any, they were leather, and at least one size too small or too large, depending on who wore them last. Most people just went barefoot, saving their shoes for the rare moment they had to impress someone important, like the village priest or the Lord's tax collector. For the nobility, things were more elaborate, but not necessarily more comfortable. A noble bride's dress might actually be new, made from silk or velvet if the family was really splashing out, read, going into debt for the rest of the year. Embroidery was a status symbol, as were pearls or little bells sewn into the hem. But don't be fooled. Those pearls probably came from a cousin's cousin who knew a guy, and that silk might just be very shiny linen after 3 washes. Noble grooms wore tunics with exaggerated sleeves, ridiculous hats, and shoes that curled up at the toes so severely you could trip just thinking about walking down the aisle. Hygiene was optional. You'd try your best to scrub off the week's grime, but there was only so much you could do with a wooden tub, some lukewarm water, and a bar of soap that doubled as an exfoliant and a lethal weapon. Hair might get a good brushing, but styling options were limited. Sometimes a hat was just the most socially acceptable way to hide whatever was living in your hair. And if you're wondering about wedding rings, don't. Only the rich could afford them, and even then, half the time they were borrowed for the ceremony and given back immediately afterward, lest someone pawned them to pay for extra bread at the feast. So when you picture your perfect medieval wedding, remember, it was less royal affair and more make-do with whatever isn't already soaking in goat milk. But hey, at least you weren't alone. Everyone else looked just as rumpled and hopeful. In a world where love was rare and soap was even rarer, showing up in mostly matching shoes was basically a fairy tale ending. Worried about catering disasters? Medieval wedding banquets were less dream day and more survival challenge. The menu featured whatever was still twitching in the pantry, plus an endless river of ale to help everyone forget the taste and the hygiene. Let's set the scene. The ceremony is finally over, your wedding tunic is clinging to you in all the wrong places, and the guests have gathered in a barn, hall, or muddy field for the main event, eating and drinking themselves into a mild stupor. You know it's a special occasion because someone has swept the dirt floor and chased the chickens outside. The aroma drifting through the air is a curious mix of roasting meat, spilled beer, and at least 3 different kinds of burning bread. Unlike today's carefully curated buffets, a medieval wedding feast was basically a lottery. The menu depended entirely on the season, the family's social standing, and how many animals managed to survive the week leading up to the big day. If your family had money, maybe there was a roast pig with an apple in its mouth, if you could find an apple that wasn't already fermented. If you were a peasant, your banquet was a bubbling cauldron of pottage, a soup-stew hybrid containing grains, roots, and mysterious floating lumps that everyone politely pretended were beans. Bread was a staple, but don't expect baguettes or dinner rolls. It was more likely a hunk of dense, jaw-breaking rye or barley bread, often bulked up with sawdust or old acorns for extra texture. You didn't slice it, you negotiated with it. Guests sometimes used the bread as a plate, and after a few courses the soggy bread would be tossed to the dogs or the poorest guests. It was the medieval version of Tupperware, minus the burping lid and with added splinters. Vegetables made an appearance, if they were in season and hadn't been eaten by rabbits first. Turnips, onions, cabbage, and leeks were popular, although popular might be too strong a word for something that looked like it had already been through a mild disaster. Anything green was suspect, either the sign of a bad harvest or the cook's attempt to impress the local priest. For the wealthy, there might even be a pie, which could be savoury or sweet, filled with anything from minced meat to dried fruit to whatever animal wandered into the kitchen that morning. And then there was the meat. At a noble wedding, you might see whole roasted birds, rabbit, venison, or, if the lord was really showing off, swan or peacock. The latter would be served with feathers reattached for maximum drama and minimum edibility. For the average villager, meat was a rare treat. If someone managed to poach a rabbit without being caught or executed, it went into the stew. Chickens were tough, geese were tougher, and anything that was still moving was considered extra fresh. Food safety was, let's say, an adventure. Refrigeration was a dream, and spices were reserved for the rich. Most cooks relied on salt, smoke, and good old-fashioned hope to keep things from going off. You ate fast, partly because the food was only going to get colder, and partly because you never knew when the next round of questionable sausages would hit the table. To wash it all down, ale, lots of ale. Water was unsafe, wine was for the wealthy, so everyone from children to grandparents drank weak beer. The good news is, it was just strong enough to help you forget you might have just bitten into a boiled mouse. As the evening wore on, guests got rowdier, the singing got louder, and the stories got more unbelievable. Someone always tried to dance, and someone always regretted it. There was no cake, at least not the kind we'd recognise. Sometimes there was a bread loaf, broken over the bride's head for luck and possible concussion. Any leftovers, if you dared, were taken home, but woe to the guest who opened the wrappings 2 days later. So next time you worry about a wedding catering mishap, remember, in medieval times, if you survived the feast without mysterious stomach cramps, you were officially blessed. And if you actually enjoyed the food, you must have drunk the ale. If you dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, think again. Most medieval weddings involved mumbled vows, a fidgety priest, and a congregation half asleep from fasting. The ceremony itself was short, but the awkwardness lasted for hours. Let's walk down the aisle, well, the packed dirt in front of the local church, which is just as likely to be hosting a wedding as a pig auction or a rainwater collection day. The church bell rings, more out of habit than celebration, echoing through the village and summoning everyone who isn't already busy with chores, or pretending to be, to avoid another wedding. The pews, if they exist at all, are hard and splintery, and there's a constant draft that makes you wonder if you should have worn your thicker tunic, suspicious stains and all. The priest is already at the front, flipping through a battered book of Latin prayers, with a look that says he'd rather be anywhere else, preferably somewhere that doesn't smell like boiled cabbage and feet. His cassock might be the fanciest piece of clothing in the room, but it's still patched in more places than it isn't, and you'd be forgiven for thinking the incense was just to mask the general odour of unwashed humanity. As for the vows themselves, don't expect any poetry. You and your soon-to-be spouse stand before the altar, eyes darting nervously between the priest, the crowd, and each other, all while trying not to fidget. The priest drones through the service, alternating between Latin you don't understand and awkward pauses you definitely do. The whole ceremony takes place in full view of the entire village, which, in a time before privacy was invented, means every cough, sneeze, and stomach growl is heard by all. There are no personalised vows, no tearful confessions of love. Instead, you repeat after the priest, mumbling responses you've barely rehearsed, hoping you get the words right so nobody thinks you're cursed. The highlight of the ceremony might be the awkward hand squeeze when you finally say "I do," though it's just as likely someone behind you is hissing reminders about proper posture or the fact that you still have straw in your hair. If you're a noble, there might be a little more fanfare, maybe a choir, or a fancy scroll with your names written in Gothic script. If you're lucky, someone has even remembered to bring flowers, but mostly it's all about making things official. Witnesses sign their names with an X, and the whole thing is written down in the parish register next to records of sheep births and local debts. The congregation's main job is to stay awake. Fasting before the ceremony means half the crowd is quietly dreaming about the feast to come, while the other half is just hoping the whole thing wraps up before the rain starts. Children fidget, babies wail, and there's always one relative loudly whispering about how their own wedding was much more impressive, and probably not true. At the end, the priest blesses you, sometimes with water, sometimes with a look that says, "Good luck, you'll need it." The bells might ring again, but it's more a signal that it's time to eat than any grand romantic gesture. You and your new spouse process down the aisle to a smattering of polite claps and more than a few stifled yawns. Afterwards, there's a brief moment where everyone congratulates you, shakes your hand, and gives you more advice than you ever wanted. There's no "just married" sign, but your awkward smiles say it all. The official business is done, and now the real challenge begins, surviving the rest of the day and the rest of your new life. So if you ever find yourself longing for a simple wedding, medieval style, just remember, the ceremony might be short, but the memory of your uncle snoring in the front row will last a lifetime. In a world where fairy tales were mostly cautionary and real life was usually itchy, just making it through the service without fainting was a happily ever after. After the last turnip had been thrown and the goats herded home, the newlyweds were shoved together for the main event, the wedding night. Privacy was optional, performance anxiety was guaranteed, and local custom sometimes included an audience. No pressure. Let's dim the torches and wander gingerly into one of the most awkward chapters of the medieval marriage saga, the wedding night. You'd think that after all the feasting, public vows, and congratulatory slaps on the back, you'd at least get a little time alone to figure out exactly what you're supposed to do next. But this is medieval Europe, where privacy is as rare as soap, and expectations are as heavy as a suit of armour. Depending on your village and the persistence of your relatives, your first night as a married couple might have been witnessed by a crowd larger than most modern dinner parties. It wasn't unusual for family, friends, and the local priest to parade you to bed, sing some very unhelpful songs about fertility, and sometimes even linger to make sure the union was properly sealed. If you're already blushing, congratulations, you're about to experience the medieval equivalent of being live-streamed without consent. The bed itself, calling it a marital bed is generous, was probably a straw mattress, shared by a few spiders, a draught, and possibly the dog if you couldn't kick him out in time. The sheets were special occasion fabric, which just meant they'd been shaken out more recently than the regular ones. If you were lucky, there were no fleas. If you were noble, you might have an actual bed frame and curtains, which mostly trapped the smell of cabbage and nerves. If you were expecting rose petals, gentle music, or a loving speech, you'd be out of luck. Instead, you got practical advice from your parents, delivered at full volume and with alarming specificity, and a crowd of relatives making jokes that have not improved with age. Some places took things to truly horrifying heights, with a bedding ceremony, where witnesses made sure everything started as planned. You might even get thrown into bed, literally, while the assembled crowd cheered and handed out advice like, "Don't forget the left side." Centuries before reality TV, the medieval wedding night was already peak public spectacle. After the door finally closed, the pressure didn't let up. The church and your community considered the wedding night to be the most important part of the marriage. No consummation, no real marriage. If you failed to produce evidence, yes, sometimes there was an inspection, and yes, it's as uncomfortable as it sounds, your union could be annulled, and your family would have to give the dowry back. So, if you thought your biggest worry was bad breath or cold feet, think again. In medieval Europe, it was all about, well, results. For most couples, nerves were high and knowledge was low. Sex education in the Middle Ages was more rumour than science, with most people relying on what little they'd overheard in the barn or from older siblings. Forget romance novels. Advice ranged from Think of England to Don't Scare the Chickens. Add in a long day of fasting, awkward clothing, and a pounding headache from all that ale, and the mood was more, let's just get through this, than unforgettable passion. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. Some couples collapsed from exhaustion. Others spent the night whispering, laughing nervously, or making promises to try again in the morning. And for every success story, there was at least one tale of a couple so mortified they spent their first night as newlyweds on opposite sides of the bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering how much trouble they'd be in if they just ran away. Still, there was something almost sweet in the awkwardness. With the pressure off and the audience gone, many couples started their real partnership not with fireworks, but with quiet conversation and shared embarrassment. The next day, you were officially a married couple, and probably a little more humble than you'd expected. So next time you're tempted to complain about a lackluster honeymoon, remember, at least your neighbours didn't sing songs outside your door and demand a progress report. In medieval times, the wedding night was just another public ordeal, and if you survived it together, you were ready for just about anything marriage could throw at you. Medieval marriages came with more rules than a board game designed by lawyers. From consanguinity charts, don't marry your cousin again, to consent requirements, the church had its nose in every marital business. Good luck reading the paperwork, it's in Latin. If you're imagining a medieval wedding as a simple affair, just you, your beloved, and a quick blessing in the village square, think again. Your marital future was tangled up in a thicket of rules, requirements, and more Latin than a first-year seminarian could handle. The church was in charge of marriage law, and they weren't shy about making sure you followed every single confusing, contradictory regulation. Let's start with the basics. Who could get married? Well, technically, any two unmarried Christians of age, but it wasn't as simple as just saying I do. There was a list of forbidden relationships, the infamous consanguinity chart, that basically mapped out your family tree and then told you, in tiny, incomprehensible writing, exactly who you couldn't marry. Spoiler, if you were related by blood, marriage, or the vague suspicion of shared ancestry within 7 degrees, it was a no-go. That included second cousins, your step-aunt, and possibly even the baker's nephew if the priest was in a bad mood. This rule was supposedly to keep family lines pure and to avoid scandal, but considering most medieval villages were one extended family, it also served as a practical way to make matchmaking feel like solving a puzzle while blindfolded. To get around this, the rich and powerful could petition for a dispensation, a special exception from the Pope, signed, stamped, and delivered with enough ceremony to make you forget you just married your fourth cousin twice removed. For the rest of us, the only paperwork you saw was a quick scribble in the parish register, and maybe a warning glare from the priest who definitely recognised your mother's chin on both sides of the aisle. Then there was consent. Modern romantics, take note. Technically, medieval law required both parties to agree to the marriage. In practice, though, a lot of consent sounded like silence, nodding, or not running away during the ceremony. For nobles, marriages were sometimes negotiated before the children were old enough to spell their own names, let alone say, I do. Parents signed contracts, exchanged dowries, and arranged everything down to who got the family pig, all before the intended bride or groom could object. If anyone changed their mind at the last minute, it was a social and legal disaster. The church was very clear. Forced marriages were invalid, but in the world of medieval power politics, voluntary was a flexible term. And let's not forget the other fine print. The ceremony had to be public and witnessed, preferably in a church. Secret weddings, also known as clandestine marriages, were discouraged but did happen, usually late at night, sometimes in a field, and always followed by lots of apologising. The priest needed to be involved, or at least notified after the fact. Bans had to be read for 3 consecutive Sundays to give anyone a chance to object, and everything had to be entered into the parish register. again in Latin, just to make sure nobody could double-check what was actually being written. If you were caught breaking the rules, consequences range from fines and public penance to outright annulment. Did you accidentally marry your cousin? That's a big oops, and now you're single again, plus your families have to return any goats, turnips, or awkward wedding gifts. Did you skip the banns or get married outside the church? The local bishop might demand an extra donation, a few days of fasting, or, if he was feeling especially holy, a pilgrimage to the nearest shrine. On top of all this, there were rules about when you could get married. No weddings during Lent, Advent, or on holy days, unless you fancy getting on the wrong side of both your neighbours and your spiritual advisor. Even consummation was regulated. If you didn't seal the deal, your marriage could be declared null and void, and everyone would talk about it at the market for months. So the next time you see a historical romance where the couple elopes in the moonlight, just remember, in reality, they'd need 3 forms of ID, a Latin dictionary, and a family tree that didn't look like a plate of spaghetti. Medieval marriage was less about romance and more about surviving the church's paperwork obstacle course, with your dignity and your goats intact. No, you can't escape them. In-laws were a medieval power couple all their own, sometimes moving in for a few weeks. Read forever. If you thought Thanksgiving was stressful, imagine every meal with your spouse's mother, who's convinced you're cursed. In medieval times, marriage wasn't just about 2 people tying the knot. It was about entire families stitching their lives together, whether they wanted to or not. There were no starter homes, no just us apartments. When you married, you usually moved in with your spouse's family, or, if you were really lucky, both sets of parents moved in with you. You didn't just gain a partner, you gained a lifelong audience for all your arguments and at least one extra critic for your cooking. Let's start with the matriarch. The medieval mother-in-law was an institution unto herself. She'd spent decades perfecting her recipe for boiled turnips and her ability to sigh loudly when you did something wrong, which, to be fair, was almost everything. She knew every superstition, every neighbour's business, and was convinced her way was not only the best way, but the only way to avoid a curse, famine, or slightly sour cheese. If your bread didn't rise, if the chickens refused to lay, or if someone stubbed their toe, you could bet she'd be muttering about bad luck brought in by strangers. Then there's your father-in-law. If he's still around, he's either silently judging you from his stool by the hearth, or telling you stories about the old days, when men could plough a whole field before sunrise, and no one had time to worry about feelings. He might occasionally offer help in the form of unsolicited advice, most of which involves using more manure or marrying richer next time. It's not just the parents. Medieval extended families were sprawling. Younger siblings, unmarried aunts, mysterious cousins, and that one elderly uncle who no one remembers inviting. Everyone seemed to find a reason to stick around. Privacy was an alien concept. Every meal was a group affair, and every bedtime came with a chorus of snoring, grumbling, and at least one loud argument about whose turn it was to feed the pig at dawn. Your in-laws didn't just judge your cooking, they judged your entire lifestyle. Were you working hard enough? Did you store enough firewood? Was your spouse looking too thin or suspiciously happy? You could expect a running commentary on everything from how you mended your clothes to the colour of your baby's hair. Gossip was the family sport, and the bench was always crowded. Of course, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Sometimes in-laws meant extra hands during harvest, an extra pair of eyes to keep the children from wandering into the duck pond, or someone to share the workload when your back finally gave out from hauling water all day. But make no mistake, every benefit came with a healthy dose of scrutiny. Moving out was rarely an option. Land was precious and houses small, so multi-generational living was the norm. If you needed advice, it was there, whether you wanted it or not. If you wanted a moment alone, you'd have to invent a new chore, like checking on the firewood in the farthest corner of the property, or inventing a very complicated system for sorting beans. Even holidays were a group performance. Religious festivals meant even more relatives under one roof, more food to prepare, and more opportunities for your in-laws to critique your gravy, your posture, and your choice of prayer. In the rare event that things got truly unbearable, you could appeal to the village priest, but odds were good he was related to your in-laws too. There was no escape, only adaptation. Over time, you learned to nod politely, fake agreement, and perfect the art of taking a very slow walk to the well. So next time you're dreading dinner with the in-laws, remember, at least you get to go home afterwards. In medieval Europe, home was wherever your in-laws decided to sit, and they always picked the spot closest to the fire and farthest from your peace and quiet. Once married, you'd move into your own house, a generous term for a damp hut, one straw bed, and a family of spiders. Decorating was easy. Whatever wasn't nailed down in your parents' house. Privacy. Only if you could out-hiss the livestock. Welcome to medieval home ownership. Forget housewarming parties and Pinterest boards. Your newlywed nest is more like a slightly improved storage shed with delusions of grandeur. The average medieval home was a single room, roughly the size of your modern bathroom, with walls made of wattle and daub, think woven sticks and mud, held together by hope and the occasional chicken feather. If you were especially lucky, the roof only leaked in 3 places and the wind whistled through just one wall. Your floor was, well, the ground. No hardwood, no tiles, just compacted dirt, occasionally swept with a bundle of twigs when company was coming over, or when someone spilled soup. The family shoes, if you owned any, lived by the door, but you mostly went barefoot, developing an intimate relationship with the local mud, moss, and anything your neighbour's goat left behind. Dust was inevitable, and the concept of spring cleaning was more of a yearly mud-shoveling event. Furnishings? Minimal to say the least. The centre of the house featured a fire pit or simple hearth for cooking and warmth, surrounded by wooden stools, each wobblier than the last, and maybe one rickety table. If you wanted to impress your in-laws, you'd borrow a bench from next door. There were no closets. Clothes hung from pegs hammered into the wall, and valuable items were hidden in chests, assuming you didn't use the chest as a bench, storage bin, and makeshift step stool, sometimes all at once. The bed was a marvel of medieval engineering, a wooden frame, if you had one, or just a pile of straw and rags in the corner. Straw mattresses offered all the comfort of sleeping on a haystack, prickly, uneven, and frequently home to a few friendly insects. In winter, you piled on wool blankets, animal skins, and anything else you could find, forming a lumpy fortress against the chill. In summer, you sweated and itched, hoping the breeze through the holes in the wall didn't bring too many new roommates. And then there were your real roommates, animals. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens often shared the space, especially at night or in bad weather. Your daily routine included not just making breakfast, but also negotiating sleeping space with a particularly territorial goose, or dodging a jealous cat. Spiders and mice came with the territory, their webs decorating the corners, and their tiny feet pattering across your bed at inconvenient hours. You didn't name them, but they probably had names for you. Windows were a luxury, and if you had one, it was a small hole with a wooden shutter, no glass, just a slab you could swing shut during storms, or when the neighbour kids started throwing turnips. Doors were solid, heavy, and usually stuck in the mud. Many houses simply had a piece of cloth or a makeshift wooden board for privacy, which mostly meant a barrier to the wind, not to prying eyes or listening ears. Personal space was a distant dream. The whole family plus livestock slept in the same room. If you wanted alone time, you'd have to invent an errand, like fetching water from the distant stream, or claim you needed to check on the chickens, again. For most, home was where the heart was, and the heart was wherever you could avoid stepping on a sharp pebble, or being sneezed on by the dog. Despite all this, people did their best to make a house a home. Maybe you hung a sprig of herbs by the door to ward off bad luck, or painted a symbol on the wall to keep away evil spirits and nosy neighbours. If you found a smooth stone or a particularly pretty stick, it became instant decor. Your first married home might have been humble, crowded, and perpetually drafty, but it was yours, at least until the roof caved in, or the pigs decided to move in permanently. So next time you grumble about your tiny apartment or slow Wi-Fi, remember, at least your walls aren't made of mud, and the only livestock you have to share your bed with are the dust bunnies under your mattress. In medieval times, a home wasn't about style or space. It was about survival and a sense of togetherness, no matter how many legs were sharing the bed. You and your new spouse now get to enjoy the medieval marital bed. It's straw-filled, lumpy, and full of more insects than love letters. Intimacy was less candlelight, more don't let the lice bite. Let's start with the bed itself. If you're picturing a sturdy four-poster draped in velvet, lower your expectations by about 4 feet. The average medieval marital bed was a wooden frame, if you were lucky, or just a pile of straw sacks if you weren't. The straw was replaced only when it absolutely had to be, so the mattress was less supportive cloud and more crunchy barn in fabric form. Every night you fluffed your bedding, which meant poking at it and hoping no one angry was living inside. Then there were the residents. Fleas, lice, and the occasional brave beetle all made their homes in your sheets. Forget sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. Bed bugs weren't a worry, because everything else got to you first. Scratching was as much a part of the bedtime routine as saying your prayers. If you wondered why medieval people often slept in their clothes, it was partly for warmth and partly as a shield against the local insect population. And it wasn't just you and your beloved. For peasants especially, beds were a family affair. Privacy was rare. If you had children, they squeezed in alongside you. If your parents or in-laws were still alive and not ready to let go of their favourite sleeping spot, they'd snuggle in too. Sometimes even a neighbour or an unlucky guest ended up sharing the family mattress. Personal space? A foreign concept. If someone rolled over, everyone rolled over. If the dog joined in, you counted yourself lucky he'd chased away the rats first. Intimacy was a challenge. You might try to whisper sweet nothings, only to be interrupted by your brother-in-law's snores or the goat snuffling from the next room. A romantic evening was less about soft lighting and more about timing, making sure the fire was out, the kids were asleep, and the livestock had wandered off to bother someone else. If you wanted real privacy, your best hope was a moonless night and a barn with a working door. Seasonal changes didn't help. In winter, you shivered under every blanket you could find, wrapping yourself around your spouse for warmth and accidentally kicking them every time you tried to warm your feet. In summer, you sweated through your linen nightshirt and prayed for a breeze that didn't also bring the scent of the pigsty. No matter the weather, someone was always either too hot, too cold, or too itchy. Cleanliness was another matter entirely. Laundry day was a big event if it happened at all. Washing the bedding required hauling water from the stream, heating it over a smoky fire and scrubbing with harsh lye soap that left your hands red and raw. Most people settled for hanging the sheets outside and letting the sun and wind do their best. As a result, the bed smelled like a blend of last week's sweat, this week's hay, and the faint, ever-present aroma of goat. If you did manage to steal a moment alone with your spouse, you were probably both so exhausted from farm chores, animal wrangling, and swatting at bugs that the most passionate thing you could muster was a muttered goodnight before collapsing into a snoring heap. Romance was there, but it was buried under a thick layer of reality, fatigue, and straw. And yet this was the heart of medieval married life. You laughed together when a mouse stole your bread. You comforted each other when the roof leaked or the baby cried. You fought for space and covers, but you always ended up in the same tangle of limbs, blankets, and dreams. There was a rough comfort to it, a sense of being in this together, even if this included an impressive collection of insect bites. So next time you fluff your pillow or stretch out in your queen-size bed, be grateful. In medieval times, sharing a bed wasn't just about romance. It was about survival, teamwork, and knowing that at least the lice weren't picky. They loved everyone equally. Congratulations, you're married. Now spend every day together milking cows, repairing thatched roofs, and arguing over who forgot to bank the fire. Romance is mostly just a team sport against starvation and cold feet, literally. Welcome to medieval married life, where every sunrise brings a to-do list longer than your wedding vows and about as much room for negotiation. The notion of happily ever after in this era really meant happily, as long as you can keep the roof from collapsing and the goats from eating the laundry. You and your spouse quickly discover that there's no such thing as his chores and her chores. There's just a never-ending mountain of work, and whoever finishes their list first gets to collapse into the straw mattress a few minutes sooner. Let's start with the basics: food. The day begins at dawn, because sleeping in is a myth reserved for nobility and sick cows. Someone has to build a fire, fetch water, and start the porridge. If you're lucky, there's bread from the day before and not too many weevils in the flour. If you're unlucky, breakfast is just something hot with a generous helping of last night's regrets. After eating, the real work begins. There are cows to be milked, which means dodging hooves and negotiating with animals that have more personality than most humans you know. Chickens must be fed, eggs collected, and any mysterious squawking investigated, because sometimes it's a fox, sometimes it's the neighbour's kid, and sometimes it's just a chicken with strong opinions. The garden needs weeding and watering, the field needs tending, and the tools are always breaking at exactly the worst time, and then there's the cleaning. Dirt floors don't sweep themselves, and you'd be amazed at how much mud, straw, and unidentified animal matter accumulates in a single day. Every surface is a potential science experiment, and if you want clean clothes, you'd better be ready to scrub, rinse, and wring until your hands are as wrinkled as your in-laws' faces when you burn the stew. Roof repairs are a constant. Thatched roofs leak, sag, and occasionally host small wildlife. Climbing up with a bundle of reeds and a prayer, you and your spouse patch holes while trying not to fall off and become the village's main source of gossip for the month. Meanwhile, wood needs chopping, fences need mending, and of course, the fire has to be kept alive all day and banked at night. If you forget, you get to start over in the freezing morning with flint frustration and your spouse's disappointed stare. Childcare is a full-time job. If you have kids, they're either helping with chores, getting underfoot, or both at the same time. Babies need tending, toddlers need chasing, and older kids need constant reminders not to fall into the well or trade the family goose for a handful of shiny rocks. There's no such thing as a babysitter, unless you count the family dog, and even he has his limits. And the social obligations don't stop. You have to attend church, check in on neighbours, help with communal tasks like harvest or repairing the village mill, and try to avoid scandal, which is tough when your tunic keeps getting caught on every possible thorn bush. If there's time left at the end of the day, you might get to sit by the hearth, share a hunk of bread, and laugh about that time you both got chased by the same angry goat. In the rare moments of quiet, you might actually remember you got married because you liked each other, or at least didn't dislike each other as much as everyone else in the village. Maybe you sneak a smile across the table, or find a way to share the last apple without an argument. So, while the to-do list is endless and the work never truly done, medieval married life was less about grand gestures and more about daily victories. Survive the chores together, and you just might make it through the winter, flea bites and all. In the end, romance isn't just flowers and poetry. Sometimes it's letting your partner have the last bite of cheese and helping them brush the hay out of their hair. Want to space out your children? Good luck. Birth control options range from just don't to herbal remedies with side effects including death. Most couples had a lot of children, partly because it was the only hobby available after sunset. Let's set the mood. The candles are flickering, the livestock are finally quiet, and you and your spouse have managed to claim a few moments of privacy. But before anything romantic can happen, you remember the not-so-little matter of medieval birth control, or more accurately, the lack of it. The Middle Ages were not exactly known for their family planning innovation. If you wanted to avoid becoming parents for the 7th time, your choices were, well, let's just say limited. The most reliable method of birth control was abstinence. Yes, that's right, the old just say no strategy. Medieval couples were sometimes advised by the church to abstain during Lent, Advent, and certain holy days, which if you were devout, or just really tired, gave you a built-in excuse for at least a few weeks each year. For everyone else, the church's main message was that marital intimacy was supposed to be for procreation, not recreation. But let's be honest, after a day of chasing goats, fixing leaks, and picking fleas out of your hair, abstinence might just sound appealing. Then there were the folk remedies. Every village had a wise woman, midwife or herbalist who would whisper about special teas and protective charms. Some recommended holding certain stones, others suggested wearing amulets, and a few went with the classic hang garlic from the bedpost technique. Effective against vampires perhaps, but not much else. Herbal concoctions were popular, but they came with their own risks. Pennyroyal, for example, was believed to work, but in the wrong dose it could cause more harm to the mother than any good to the family planning efforts. Most of these remedies were a gamble, at best ineffective, at worst genuinely dangerous. There were also physical methods, if you can call them that. Everything from tying knots in your undergarments to leaping backwards after, romance was tried at least once. Some manuals suggested complicated positions, timing, or prayers. And then there were the truly wild ideas like drinking mixtures made from beaver testicles, ground roots, or questionable river water. Spoiler alert, none of these methods were tested by scientists, and most were handed down by that one neighbour who also claimed to have invented a rain dance. Condoms in a form did exist, but don't expect anything you'd see in a modern pharmacy. Some were made from animal intestines or linen cloth soaked in various substances. If you could get past the discomfort and the smell, you deserved a medal just for trying. Even then, access was rare and knowledge even rarer. For most couples, the bottom line was this: if you spent enough time together, children were simply part of the deal. High infant mortality meant the average family aimed for quantity over careful planning. If 1 or 2 children survived to adulthood, you were considered lucky. If more did, you had extra hands for the harvest, and later, more help to take care of you in your old age. It was practical, if not exactly romantic. The social pressure was real too. Having a large family was seen as a blessing, a sign of God's favour, and sometimes the only way to ensure your name survived past the next famine. Childlessness, on the other hand, sparked suspicion and gossip. Couples with no children might find themselves whispered about, blamed for bad harvests, or even accused of witchcraft. So, in the end, the mystery of medieval birth control was really more a case of resigned acceptance. If you wanted to avoid more children, you needed a miracle, or a lot of luck. For everyone else, the cycle continued. Sunset, chores, a few hopeful or panicked glances, and then, 9 months later, the midwife making her way down the lane again. So next time you hear about the good old days, remember, when it came to family planning, medieval couples were basically winging it, and judging by the size of most families, that plan rarely worked. Pregnancy in medieval times was basically an extreme sport. Childbirth was so dangerous, neighbours sometimes gathered just to see who survived. Mother, baby, both, or neither. The only pain relief was holding someone's hand and praying really hard. Imagine you've just found out you're expecting. Congratulations, or condolences, depending on your level of medieval optimism. There are no ultrasound appointments, no prenatal vitamins, and definitely no helpful apps counting down the weeks. The only way to track your progress is by the size of your belly, how much your back aches, and how many neighbours have started bringing over lucky bread and cryptic advice. Pregnancy was both celebrated and feared, because everyone knew that getting through the next 9 months was only half the battle. From the start, you were bombarded with advice, most of it only slightly more helpful than a fortune cookie. Some said you mustn't eat cold foods, look at ugly animals, or walk under ladders, lest you curse your baby with a squint, a limp, or an unfortunate personality. The village midwife, a walking encyclopedia of local superstitions, would hand you amulets, tell you which herbs to steep, and remind you daily that any wrong move might bring about the bad luck. Pregnant women became magnets for old wives' tales. Tie a red thread around your ankle, Don't sit too close to the fire. Never let a cat cross your path unless it's Tuesday. Diet was a challenge. If you craved anything beyond turnips, cabbage, and yesterday's bread, you were probably out of luck. The richer you were, the better your odds of a varied diet. But for most, nutrition was simply eat what's left. No one knew about vitamins or the importance of folic acid. If you had morning sickness, the local cure might be a drink of vinegar, a slap on the back, or a stern lecture about not being ungrateful. Medical care was a lottery. There were no doctors, only the midwife and maybe an old herbalist, with a collection of roots and a suspiciously large knife. Most of the time, these women did their best, but there was only so much they could do with the tools of the time. Hot water, old rags, and a lot of whispered prayers. The church liked to get involved too, offering blessings and holy relics, just in case your labour needed a little extra divine intervention. When the time finally came, childbirth was a communal event. The midwife, a few experienced neighbours, and sometimes the priest all crammed into your tiny house. Fathers were typically banned from the room, partly because they were considered bad luck, partly because no one wanted them fainting into the fire. The air was thick with incense, boiling water, and anticipation. Neighbours might cluster outside hoping for good news, and let's be honest, also for a bit of gossip. Labour was long, loud, and frightening. There were no epidurals, no sterile gloves, and definitely no gentle spa music. Your options for pain relief were gripping someone's hand, biting on a stick, or yelling at the midwife, who had seen it all before and took it in stride. Complications were common, and most were simply beyond anyone's skilled handle. Breech births, twins, fevers, each came with a roll of the dice. The line between life and death was so thin that every safe delivery felt like a minor miracle. If the baby survived and you survived, celebration was immediate. Someone dashed off to fetch the priest for a quick baptism because infant mortality was high and no one wanted to risk a soul stuck in limbo. If things went badly, there was mourning, but also a grim communal resilience. People didn't dwell. There simply wasn't time. There were more chores, more children, and more hope that the next time would go better. So if you ever complain about hospital food or noisy delivery rooms, remember your medieval ancestors. For them, pregnancy and childbirth really were acts of faith, bravery, and a healthy dash of panic. In a world without anesthesia, antibiotics, or even the comfort of a soft pillow, survival was a victory worth celebrating, every single time. Once the baby arrived, so did the terror. Medieval parenting meant cloth diapers, constant illness, and a survival rate lower than your houseplants. Sleep training was just hoping the chickens didn't wake up first. Let's start with the good news. Congratulations, you survived childbirth. The village midwife pats you on the back. The priest rushes in to christen the newborn before anything can go wrong, and everyone is briefly thrilled, until reality sets in. Because now you're in charge of keeping a tiny, helpless, alarmingly loud person alive, in a house made of mud and optimism. First challenge, diapers. There were no disposables, wipes, or cute changing tables. Medieval diapers were rags or bits of cloth, reused until they disintegrated into a new kind of dust. If you were lucky, you had enough old linen scraps to rotate, but chances are you spent much of your day scrubbing, rinsing, and hanging cloth on bushes, praying for a sunny breeze and the mercy of the local flies. Accidents were frequent, and in winter, frozen cloth was basically a parenting rite of passage. Most parents developed a keen sense of smell and a tolerance for it. Hygiene was a fantasy. Babies crawled on dirt floors, tasted whatever was in reach, and often shared their sleeping quarters with chickens, goats, or at least one judgmental cat. Bathing was infrequent and involved hauling water from the well, heating it, and hoping you finished before the baby decided to squirm into the firewood pile. Soap was rough, homemade, and doubled as paint remover, so baths were more about rinsing than real cleaning. Feeding the baby was its own adventure. Breastfeeding was the default. There was no formula, no bottles, and if you couldn't produce milk, a neighbour might step in as a wet nurse. The diet was whatever the mother could eat. so if turnips and pottage were on the menu, that's what the baby got through her. Weaning happened early, usually out of necessity, by mashing bread with water or goat's milk and hoping the child liked their food, chunky and mildly suspicious. Illness was a constant worry. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and most childhood diseases were still mysterious forces, blamed on bad air or angry saints. Fevers, coughs, and rashes appeared with terrifying regularity. Every sniffle became a family crisis, with the midwife dispensing herbal remedies and relatives offering every charm and superstition in the book. Teething was survived through a mixture of cold roots, hard bread, and, for the parents, nervous pacing. Sleep. Don't count on it. Babies woke up whenever they liked, usually whenever you'd just fallen asleep. There were no cribs, only shared straw mattresses or wooden boxes padded with rags. Rocking the baby was done by hand or, if you were busy, by letting the oldest sibling do laps around the room. Nighttime was a chorus of crying babies, restless toddlers, and the occasional livestock shuffle. The phrase "sleep when the baby sleeps" wasn't invented yet, but if it had been, it would have come with an eye roll and a mug of weak ale. As the child grew, the chaos continued. Toddlers were walking bundles of curiosity, dirt, and danger. There were no toys except sticks, stones, and whatever you could filch from the kitchen. The main job of a medieval parent was to keep the little ones from drowning in the well, eating the soap, or chasing the geese. Scraped knees, bumps, and bruises were part of growing up, and surviving past the age of 5 was considered a minor miracle. And yet through all this there were bright moments. A baby's first laugh, a toddler's clumsy hug, the pride of seeing your child take on their first tiny chores. You celebrated every small victory because you knew the odds were always against you. Parenting was exhausting, relentless, and sometimes terrifying. But in a world full of uncertainty, your family was both your anchor and your hope for the future. So next time your toddler smears applesauce on the walls or refuses to nap, remember, at least your chickens aren't waking them up, and the only thing in your diaper pail is diapers. In medieval times, every new day was a test, and making it through with your sanity and your child was a win worth celebrating. Medieval homes weren't just crowded, they were bursting at the seams with relatives. Every wedding added more cousins to your chore list, and no one ever moved out. Family reunions were daily, and nobody brought dessert. Welcome to the real medieval household, where the concept of nuclear family is as foreign as indoor plumbing. Once you're married, you don't just gain a spouse. You get a package deal. Aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, and the occasional mysterious relative who claims to be just passing through for the 6th month in a row. The family tree has so many branches, it's a miracle the house isn't just a pile of roots. Your home is packed tighter than a winter hayloft. Every room, corner, and even the storage loft over the livestock pen has someone's sleeping mat or makeshift bed. Privacy is a theoretical concept. Any attempt at an intimate conversation is doomed to be interrupted by a cousin looking for bread, an aunt with urgent news, or your great-uncle who has taken up residence in the warmest spot by the hearth and refuses to budge. Mealtime is a group sport. 1 pot of stew stretches to feed 12, and the first rule is eat fast or go hungry. There's always a scramble for the biggest ladle of pottage, and the second someone finishes, a younger cousin is already eyeing their bowl. Conversation is a mix of gossip, laughter, and someone loudly complaining that things were better in the old days, usually someone who never helps with the dishes. The chore list grows with every new family addition. Medieval homes weren't just a place to live, they were production centres, workplaces and daycares rolled into one. Everyone over the age of 3 is expected to help with something, whether it's fetching water, feeding the chickens, or herding toddlers away from the fireplace. You might spend the morning repairing the fence, the afternoon baking bread with your aunt, and the evening weaving baskets with cousins while swapping stories and snide remarks. Then there are the family dramas. Every large household comes with extra helpings of old grudges, ancient rivalries, and a running tally of who owes whom a favour, or more commonly a chicken. Aunt Edith hasn't forgiven Cousin Edwin for breaking her spindle 2 winters ago, and no one will let you forget the time you burned the stew and nearly smoked out half the village. Apologies are rare. Forgiveness is conditional, and every small quarrel is a potential saga. But as much as everyone complains, the family always manages to band together when it counts, at least until the next argument over missing socks or who gets the last crust of bread. The holidays crank up the chaos. Religious festivals, saints' days, and even the odd wedding or funeral can swell the household to bursting. Guests camp out on straw, fill every spare nook, and eat through winter stores at terrifying speed. The kitchen is a whirlwind of flour, squawking chickens, and shouts for someone to stir the pot, while another group tries to wedge themselves around the fire. Forget a quiet celebration. Every event is a raucous parade of relatives, loud music, and heated discussions about the correct way to make oatcakes. And yet, for all the squabbles and shoulder bumps, extended family life in the Middle Ages had its upsides. There was always someone to help when a chore needed doing, always an older cousin to watch the kids or an aunt to lend advice, wanted or not. You never face life's challenges alone. When illness struck or the harvest failed, the collective effort kept the household afloat. So the next time you sigh at a crowded family holiday, be grateful that you can send everyone home at the end of the night. In the medieval world, home was forever. No evictions, no privacy, but a lot of hands to lighten the load. The drama was daily, but so was the support. And if you were lucky, maybe, just maybe, someone remembered to save you the last piece of bread. Sure, there were happy couples, but most medieval marriages were less about bliss and more about survival, teamwork, and a slow-burning hope that next year's harvest wouldn't kill you both. Let's pause to imagine the quiet moments that did exist amid the daily grind. If you were lucky, you and your spouse discovered a partnership that made the struggle less lonely. But it's important to remember, marital bliss in medieval times didn't look anything like what you see on wedding-themed reality shows. There were no breakfast-in-bed Instagram posts, no candlelit anniversaries, and certainly no romantic getaways, unless you counted running after a loose sheep in the rain. Instead, happiness was measured in small victories. A good harvest, a mild winter, a child who survived teething, or a loaf of bread that rose just right. These were the moments that got celebrated. On a quiet evening, you might share a joke while patching a tunic by firelight, or exchange a tired smile as you both collapsed, muddy and exhausted after a day in the fields. Sometimes, I love you sounded a lot like, I fed the animals, or I didn't burn the porridge today. You took comfort in knowing someone else understood exactly how cold your feet were at 3 a.m. Expectations were pragmatic. Most couples didn't marry for love. They married for security, children, and the social glue that kept the village running. Still, sometimes affection grew, a kind of partnership forged in the fires of joint suffering and constant crisis management. Maybe your spouse made you laugh when the stew burned, or you learned to enjoy working side by side, even if half the work was shooing goats off the roof. Medieval romance was subtle, a stolen glance, a patch sewn onto your best shirt, or the rare moment when someone saved you the last spoonful of broth. But for every gentle moment, there were disappointments. Life was tough and unfair. A single bad harvest could mean months of hunger, and illness could sweep through the household overnight. Disagreements, both petty and serious, were part of daily life. Couples argued about money, or the lack thereof, in-laws whose turn it was to fetch water, and whether it was worth fixing the drafty door. Privacy was rare, stress was constant, and tempers sometimes flared. Sleeping on the couch was replaced by sleeping on the slightly colder corner of the straw bed. And then there were the truly hard times. Losses that modern couples can barely imagine. Children who didn't survive infancy, parents lost to disease, fields flattened by hail, or a house lost to fire. Grief was a regular guest at the table. In these moments, a strong marriage could be a lifeline, a source of comfort and resilience that helped you get through the next impossible day. Or, if things soured, disappointment could settle in, hardening into resentment that lasted a lifetime, or at least until next year's miracle crop. Some people, of course, never found real happiness in marriage. Maybe you were paired with someone grumpy, or unreliable, or just completely uninterested in sharing life's burdens. In a world where divorce was nearly impossible, many simply learned to endure, finding friendship elsewhere or pouring their energy into children, neighbours, or work. If you needed to vent, there was always a neighbour at the well, ready to trade complaints and a laugh. And yet, medieval people were remarkably resilient. Hope was never entirely snuffed out. Not while the seasons kept turning and children kept growing. Each new spring was a chance for things to get better, for families to thrive, and for a little bit of joy to sneak in between all the work. So if you imagine medieval marriage as an endless struggle, you wouldn't be wrong, but you'd be missing the quiet, stubborn hope that kept people going. Bliss in this world wasn't a grand gesture. It was a nod across the table, a shared loaf of bread, and the knowledge that at least you weren't facing life's hardships alone. That, in the Middle Ages, was sometimes more than enough. Cheating wasn't unheard of, but in a small village everyone knew everyone's business. Affairs were risky, gossip was deadly, and forgiveness was mostly a rumour. Imagine waking up in a world where you can't send a secret text, can't meet someone in a discreet cafe, and can't even exchange a flirty look across a crowded pub without someone's grandmother noticing and reporting back before you even finish your ale. Medieval villages were basically open-plan offices, minus the ergonomic chairs and plus a lot more turnips. Walls were thin, privacy was rare, and people had a sixth sense for drama. Still, temptation is as old as marriage itself. Maybe you're married to someone who snores like a wounded ox and smells like the family compost heap. Maybe your true love is the shepherd next door, who, despite only owning one tunic, somehow makes it work. The options weren't great, but sometimes sparks flew where they shouldn't. The risks, however, were enormous. First, there's the surveillance state known as your neighbours. Forget security cameras, they had eyes everywhere, and nothing was more exciting than the possibility of a scandal. Thatched roofs and open doors meant most trysts had an audience of hens, children, or a passing in-law. If you were caught in a compromising position, you could count on being the subject of relentless gossip for months, years, if you were really unlucky. Did you hear about Agnes and the blacksmith? Would echo around the village long after Agnes's grandchildren were running barefoot through the mud. The church, of course, was always watching, or at least listening for confessions. Adultery was considered a grave sin. If word got out, you could expect a stern talking to from the priest, public penance, and the kind of social shaming that made you wish you'd just stuck to gardening. For women, the stakes were especially high. An unfaithful wife could be cast out, lose her children, or even face physical punishment depending on local customs. Men could get away with more, but not much. An angry husband, brother, or father-in-law could make your life miserable in more ways than one. Affairs still happened, mostly because humans are creative and stubborn. Some found ways to sneak off during market days, pretending to buy onions but really arranging secret meetings behind the mill. Love letters were rare since most people couldn't write, but small tokens, a ribbon, a lock of hair, a slightly less mouldy hunk of bread, were sometimes exchanged. A stolen glance in church or a whispered word at the well was enough to get the rumour mill going, and soon the whole village was embroidering the story with extra scandalous details. If you got caught, damage control was tough. Excuses were invented. I was just helping her fix her fence. But nobody believed you. If you were unlucky enough to get someone pregnant, things escalated quickly. Family meetings were called, the priest was summoned, and someone always ended up crying. In rare cases, the matter could end in violence, a duel with pitchforks, or at least a very awkward dinner with both families glaring at each other across the table. Forgiveness? That was rare. Marriages had to keep functioning, but trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to mend. The best-case scenario was that people eventually got bored and moved on to the next scandal. Maybe someone's cow wandered off with the neighbour's goat, or the lord's son fell in the well. More often, the bitterness lingered, simmering quietly for years. And yet, despite the risks, infidelity never completely disappeared. Love is stubborn, desire is unpredictable, and village life, however small, was never as simple or as innocent as it looked from the outside. Couples found ways to cope. Some quietly ignored affairs, some argued loudly about them, and some just tried to keep the peace and get on with the endless grind of daily life. So the next time you think about medieval romance, remember, the stakes were higher, the secrets harder to keep, and the price of a single kiss could be a lifetime of side-eye at the Sunday market. In the Middle Ages, love triangles were less steamy drama, and more, well, there goes the neighbourhood. Every marriage has arguments, but medieval ones often ended with a neighbour barging in and offering opinions. Divorce? Almost impossible. Your best option was to sleep on the straw in the corner and hope nobody noticed. Let's set the scene. It's late, the fire's gone out, and you're freezing under your pile of questionably clean blankets. You're convinced your spouse forgot to bank the fire again, but they insist it was your turn. Thus begins the timeless marital debate, louder than the rooster, more public than you'd like, and inevitably the entertainment for any nearby relatives and half the village. Privacy was a fantasy. With whole families, and sometimes in-laws and livestock, crammed under one leaky roof, there was no such thing as a private argument. If you tried to whisper, someone would cough just to remind you that every word was being heard. Children, cousins, and even the neighbour's goat seemed to sense tension and gather for the drama. Medieval homes had paper-thin walls, if they had any at all, so even your quietest grumbling was fair game for family commentary. Disputes were rarely about romance and almost always about survival. Firewood, food, chores, and whose turn it was to haul water in the pouring rain were regular battlegrounds. If you burned the bread, let the chickens escape, or wasted good lamp oil on something as frivolous as reading, an argument was guaranteed. Sometimes it was over the small stuff, a missing wooden spoon or someone's muddy boots. Other times, it was about bigger issues, like whether to help the neighbours during harvest or which cousin should be trusted with the last of the salt. There were no self-help books, no couples therapy, and certainly no retreat weekends. Most disputes played out in real time, surrounded by family, and were sometimes settled by whoever could shout the loudest or wield the best guilt trip. If things got truly heated, a neighbour might poke their head in to mediate, or just to see whose side offered better snacks. Humour played a big part in smoothing things over. A well-timed joke, a silly face, or the sudden appearance of the family dog doing something ridiculous could break the tension. After all, you couldn't afford to hold grudges for long. The farm needed running, the livestock needed care, and winter was always coming. Teamwork wasn't optional, it was survival. And yet, tempers sometimes flared so hot you wondered if someone would actually storm out. If you needed to cool off, the only option was to step outside, and in winter that meant risking frostbite, or at least a muddy trip to the privy. If you were particularly stubborn, you might grab your straw pillow and camp out by the fire or in the animal shed. Of course, this made you the target of even more jokes the next day. Divorce? Don't even think about it. The church took marriage very seriously. Unless you could prove your spouse was a secret criminal, a close relative, surprise, or had run off and joined a monastery, you were pretty much stuck. Annulment was possible but rare, involving more paperwork and Latin than most peasants saw in a lifetime. For everyone else, reconciliation was less about saying sorry and more about simply getting back to work. You grumbled, you muttered, and by the next morning, you were both too busy chasing pigs to remember why you were angry. Neighbours played the part of uninvited referees, cheerleaders, and rumour spreaders. Any particularly juicy dispute would make the rounds at church or market day, with everyone weighing in. Did you hear about Edith and that burnt porridge? Became the medieval version of a trending topic. If things got really out of hand, the village elder or priest might step in, offering sage advice, or just telling everyone to get back to their chores. So next time you have a heated debate over laundry or leftovers, take comfort. At least you can close a door, vent on social media, or binge watch a show in peace. In the Middle Ages, every fight was a community event, forgiveness was practical, and your best hope for privacy was out-hissing the family cat. If you could survive a medieval marriage spat, you could survive anything. Just don't let the fire go out. The local priest was more involved in your marriage than your own spouse. Religious rules governed everything from when you could, be together, to what foods you could eat after. Confessionals were busier than Tinder. Welcome to medieval married life, where the most persistent third wheel in your relationship isn't your mother-in-law, it's the church. In an age where most people's knowledge of love and marriage came straight from the pulpit, or was whispered through a web of gossip, your spiritual leader kept very close tabs on your happiness, your habits, and frankly, your bedroom activities. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was downright suspicious. The church's reach extended into every corner of marital life. First, there were all the rules about when you could be intimate with your spouse. Spoiler alert, it wasn't very often. Advent, Lent, and countless saints' days were all off limits, as were Sundays, Fridays, and any day that ended with the priest looking at you disapprovingly. If you were trying to count up the available days for romance, you'd need an abacus and a willingness to be disappointed. And it didn't stop there. If you did get lucky enough to sneak in some together time, there were strict rules about how, where, and even why. Passion was for procreation, not recreation. Frivolous intimacy was discouraged, and you were expected to confess your sins if you got a little too enthusiastic. Couples who ignored the guidelines risked more than just spiritual guilt. The priest might deliver a pointed sermon the next Sunday, with thinly veiled references to certain unnamed sinners. You'd spend the rest of the week dodging knowing glances at the market. The confessional booth became the medieval equivalent of relationship counselling, minus the privacy, and plus the threat of eternal damnation. Husbands confessed that they'd been thinking impure thoughts. Wives confessed to wanting a break from their endlessly demanding households, and the priest kept a mental list of who needed extra prayer, and maybe a stern talking to. If a couple's problems were serious, the priest might show up at your home for a chat, and you couldn't exactly say no. Spiritual guidance was a social obligation. But the priest wasn't your only spiritual supervisor. The whole village, armed with centuries of superstition and half-remembered sermons, was ready to enforce the rules. If someone thought your marriage looked a little too happy, or not happy enough, they'd be quick to gossip. She's been smiling too much lately, it must be a sin, or he hasn't brought home firewood in a week, maybe he's under a curse. The grapevine was alive and well, and every slip-up from skipping church to arguing over firewood became a topic of heated debate. Food was also subject to the church's meddling. Certain days required fasting, abstinence from meat, or special holy meals. If you got it wrong, someone would notice, and someone would report you. Eating bacon on a Friday? That was practically a criminal offence. Forgetting to bless your bread before eating it. Prepare for the priest to drop by with a look that could curdle milk. It wasn't all bad, though. The church provided a sense of structure and community, and many couples relied on their faith to get through tough times. The priest performed weddings, blessed pregnancies, and helped resolve disputes, or at least told you to stop fighting for the sake of your immortal souls. The church calendar gave life a rhythm, and even the endless rules gave you something to talk about besides the weather. But make no mistake, the church's gaze was everywhere. You lived, loved, and argued under the watchful eyes of both God and your neighbours, with every confession, celebration, and mistake etched into the collective memory of the village. Even your attempts at romance were weighed, measured, and sometimes found wanting by a man whose main hobby was inventing new reasons for you to feel guilty. So next time you worry about your in-laws prying, remember medieval marriage. In those days, everyone, divine or otherwise, had a say in your happiness, your habits, and most of all, your secrets. If you survived with your dignity and faith intact, you deserved a medal, or at least a discreet nod from the priest during Sunday Mass. Sickness hit hard and often, with no real medicine and lots of superstitious advice. Caring for your spouse meant hauling water, praying, and hoping the cure wasn't worse than the disease. Medieval marriage vows usually included something like, in sickness and in health, and, boy, did the sickness part keep you busy. Illness wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a constant looming threat, like a nosy neighbour who also happened to carry the plague. The list of possible ailments was impressive. Coughs, fevers, infected wounds, mysterious rashes, stomach bugs, and the ever-popular sweating sickness, which was just as much fun as it sounds. If you managed to dodge those, there was always an outbreak of something unpronounceable to keep life exciting. The first sign of illness, a cough, a flushed cheek, or a faint groan from your spouse, sent the household into full crisis mode. There were no doctors to call, no helpful nurse hotlines, and certainly no handy packets of cold medicine. Instead, you relied on the family healer, who might be your mother-in-law or that aunt who claimed she could cure anything with cabbage soup, the local midwife, or, if you were desperate, the village priest. Medical knowledge was limited to herbal remedies, prayers, and a generous belief in the power of leeches. Herbal remedies were the go-to, but the recipes were more art than science. You might boil willow bark for pain, rub garlic on wounds, or brew a tea from whatever was growing in the hedgerow. Some advice made sense: ginger for nausea, honey for a sore throat, but just as often the cure sounded like a dare. Just chew on this root, sprinkle some ashes on your feet, and hop in a circle 3 times at dawn. If it didn't work, at least it kept you distracted. If things looked really dire, out came the superstitions. There were charms to hang over the bed, prayers to specific saints, and special rituals for driving out bad airs or evil humours. The house might be filled with incense, the windows flung open regardless of the season, and the floors scrubbed with vinegar. If your spouse started seeing visions, it was either a fever dream or the result of too much of Aunt Edith's miracle broth. And then there were the leeches. Medieval people really loved leeches, so much that if you'd lived through one illness, you'd probably been drained more than the family wine barrel. If you survived the treatment, you could probably survive anything. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything from headaches to heartbreak. You lay on the bed, white as a bedsheet, while your spouse muttered encouraging words and tried not to faint at the sight of all that blood. Caring for a sick spouse was exhausting. It meant hauling endless buckets of water, heating it over the fire, changing sweat-soaked linens, and fanning a feverish brow. There were no sick days. Chores still needed doing, animals needed feeding, and children needed wrangling. You'd hope that neighbours brought soup, or at least offered to pray for you, but more often they stopped by for updates and to remind you of that one time they survived something much worse. Despite all the odds some people pulled through, surviving illness together created a bond stronger than any romantic gesture. Nothing says, "I love you," like holding your spouse's hair back while they retch, or staying up all night just to see if they'll breathe easier by morning. These were the moments when your vows were put to the test, not in grand speeches, but in silent, steady endurance. Sometimes, though, there was nothing you could do. Illness swept through households, leaving grief in its wake. Medieval people learned to live with loss, to treasure every healthy day, and to support each other however they could. A marriage that survived in sickness was a partnership forged in the fires of uncertainty and heartbreak, a true testament to human stubbornness and love. So the next time you reach for a bottle of cough syrup or schedule a doctor's visit, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. Their world was a place where survival was never guaranteed, and every day of good health was a tiny victory. In sickness and in health wasn't just a promise. It was a daily prayer whispered by candlelight, hoping the worst was finally over. If your spouse died, which was fairly likely, congratulations, you're now a widow or widower. Life didn't get easier, remarriage was expected, but so was a lot of sad bread and questionable advice from relatives. In medieval Europe, making it to "till death do us part" was less of a grand achievement, and more of an inevitable milestone. With sickness, accidents, childbirth complications and random outbreaks of plague, death was never more than a cough away. When you found yourself suddenly single, there wasn't time for months of dramatic mourning. Life, and all its endless chores, went on whether you wanted it to or not. The community's response to your new status was swift and dramatic. First came the neighbours, appearing with casseroles, stale bread, and a running commentary on your morning attire. If you were a woman, you might find yourself swaddled in black for a prescribed mourning period, which lasted anywhere from a few weeks to years, depending on your family, your village, and just how much everyone wanted to remind you that you were now officially alone. For men, mourning could be slightly more relaxed, but don't expect anyone to let you wallow in peace. There were always fields to plough and animals to feed, even if your heart felt like a cold stone. Widowhood was no romantic period of reflection. Instead, it was a parade of practical decisions and uncomfortable conversations. You'd suddenly have to navigate the tricky world of inheritance. What land or goods could you keep, and what had to go to your children, your in-laws, or the lord of the manor? Medieval law was clear on some points and hopelessly murky on others. If you were childless, you risked losing everything and being shuffled off to a relative's home. If you were lucky enough to have adult children, congratulations, you might just get to keep your chickens. Relatives, of course, had opinions about your next move. Every family had at least one well-meaning aunt or a pushy uncle who decided it was time to help you plan your future. For widows, the advice was usually remarry and quickly. A new marriage meant protection, stability, and someone to help with the chores, not to mention another chance to provide grandchildren for the family tally. Widowers faced similar pressure, though a little less intense. After all, someone still had to keep the household running, and remarriage was a practical solution to a very practical problem. But not all remarriages were easy, or even wanted. Some widows preferred to keep their independence, running their own households, raising their children, and managing their affairs without a new husband to boss them around. Of course, this came with challenges: stray sheep, leaky roofs, and the constant threat of someone deciding you'd make a good wife for your own good. If you refused, expect plenty of whispers at church, pointed glances at the market, and the occasional bit of malicious gossip about strange women who like to live alone. There was also the challenge of grief. Medieval people weren't as stoic as history sometimes claims. They mourned deeply, wrote laments, and prayed for their lost loved ones. But time was not on their side. Most widows and widowers had to put on a brave face, keep working, and carry on with daily life. Mourning didn't get you out of chores, bills, or social expectations. If you were a widow with young children, you'd suddenly be both mother and father, teacher and breadwinner, comforter and chief bedtime monster fighter. Widowhood could bring unexpected freedom as well. Some women managed to claim their late husband's business, property or trade, running things with surprising skill. Others became important figures in their villages, sought out for advice and wisdom. But these stories were the exception, not the rule. For most, widowhood was about resilience, finding small moments of solace in a mug of ale, a quiet evening by the fire, or the laughter of children. So next time you think of happily ever after, remember, for medieval people, after was its own adventure, full of new hurdles, strange advice, and a lot of sad bread. Whether you remarried, stood your ground, or just tried to keep the house from falling apart, widowhood was a new chapter, one where surviving again was its own kind of triumph. Thinking of calling it quits. In medieval Europe, divorce was about as likely as winning the lottery, if the lottery only offered more chores as the prize. Annulments were possible but required enough paperwork to choke a goat. Let's say you're at your wit's end. Your spouse snores like a drunken bear. Your in-laws have officially declared war on your soup recipe, and the only romance left in your marriage is arguing about who left the door open for the goats, again. You start to wonder, could I just leave? Not unless you were prepared for a journey more complicated than the Crusades, complete with more Latin, more judgmental priests, and most likely more goats. Divorce, as we know it today, was virtually non-existent in medieval Europe. The church ruled marriage with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, one covered in saints' medals and occasionally gravy stains. Marriage was a sacrament, not a contract. Once you said "I do," you were in it for life, for better, or much, much worse. The only way out was if one of you died, or if you were exceptionally determined and well-connected, if you could prove you never should have been married in the first place. This is where annulments come in. Annulment wasn't divorce, it was the church's way of saying, never mind, that didn't count. Maybe you were secretly related, third cousins 5 times removed, through your great-uncle's goat. Maybe you hadn't given proper consent, or maybe one of you was already married to someone else and forgot to mention it. If you could check the right boxes, collect the right witnesses, and survive the marathon of paperwork, all in Latin of course, you might be granted an annulment. But unless you were a noble with serious connections, or the Pope owed your family a favour, it was a rare event. For the average peasant, even suggesting it was more likely to earn you a trip to the confessional than a fresh start. The process itself was a spectacle. You had to gather evidence, line up witnesses, and explain your personal business to the local bishop, who probably already knew more about your marriage than you did. If things moved forward, your case might be sent up the ecclesiastical food chain, all the way to Rome. The final judgment could take months or years. In the meantime, you were still stuck under the same leaky roof, sharing chores, awkward silences, and the world's least satisfying marital bed. The church did, very rarely, allow for what they called separation from bed and board. You might be able to live apart, but you couldn't remarry. Your spouse could still show up at your door demanding help with the harvest or offering unsolicited advice about your cooking. You'd get all the disadvantages of divorce and none of the freedom. If you were caught living with someone new, or, heaven forbid, got caught having an affair, the consequences were swift and public. Fines, public penance, and social ostracism were the mild end of the punishment spectrum. The church could force you back together, demand you confess your sins, and make your personal misery the hottest gossip in town. For the rich and powerful, there were loopholes, sometimes big enough to drive a cart through. Nobles could afford the best canon lawyers, creative genealogies, and sometimes a little bribe on the side. Kings and queens set the example, wrangling annulments from the Pope himself if they needed a new alliance or a male heir. But for the average villager, the dream of a fresh start stayed just that. A dream, quickly squashed by reality, and possibly by your spouse's rolling pin. So next time you hear about the good old days of marriage, remember, for most people, there was no exit. You just gritted your teeth, perfected the art of passive-aggressive bread slicing, and hoped that eventually you and your spouse could at least agree on the best way to patch a roof. In medieval Europe, marriage was for life, and sometimes it felt even longer. If you made it to old age together, you were basically a celebrity. Growing old with your spouse was rare, usually involved a lot of shared grumbling, and meant you had outlived everyone's expectations, except maybe your own teeth. In medieval Europe, survival was the real love story. Most couples didn't get the luxury of celebrating silver or golden anniversaries. Between plagues, famine, accidents, and the hazards of everyday life, looking at you, angry geese, making it to your 50s with your partner by your side was a minor miracle and a source of village gossip. Old couples were treated with a curious mix of awe, respect, and confusion. How did they make it this far? The answer, more often than not, was stubbornness, luck, and a mutual agreement to keep each other's secrets. If you and your spouse found yourselves greying together, congratulations, you were now the village elders, whether you wanted the job or not. People came to you for advice on everything from how to keep bread from moulding to which saint to pray to when the cows looked gloomy. Of course, your main qualification was simply that you hadn't died yet. Your expertise on marriage was based less on romance and more on the collective wisdom gathered from decades of teamwork, hardship and side-eye over the dinner table. Day-to-day life didn't really slow down, even as your joints creaked and your hair thinned. You were expected to keep helping with chores, minding grandchildren, and lending a hand during harvest. Just maybe with a little more sitting and a little less sprinting after runaway pigs. The division of labour shifted. Perhaps your spouse handled more of the heavy lifting, while you became the undisputed master of finding the softest patch of straw, or knowing exactly how to stretch a meal when company showed up unannounced. Grumbling was an art form. Old married couples could bicker about anything. The best way to stack firewood, whose turn it was to tell the grandkids a bedtime story, or why the stew never tasted quite as good as it did 30 years ago. These weren't bitter arguments, but the gentle background noise of two people who'd weathered every storm together, and now had the luxury of complaining just for fun. In the evenings you'd sit by the fire, maybe snoring in turns, while the world kept spinning around you. Senility was a fact of life, and memory loss was met with patience, humour, and sometimes creative storytelling. Did I already tell you about the time I chased the fox out of the chicken coop? Yes, dear, twice today. Forgetfulness was another thing to share, and as long as one of you remembered how to find the privy and when to stir the soup, you were doing just fine. Sometimes the children and grandchildren would gather and marvel at your stories, unsure which were true and which had grown with every retelling. Outliving expectations brought a special kind of freedom. You'd seen it all: weddings, funerals, harvest feasts, and the changing faces of your ever-growing extended family. You might spend your days giving sage advice or just enjoying the peace of knowing that, at last, nobody expected you to climb on the roof or chase after chickens. Maybe you even found time to sit in the sun and reminisce with your partner about the good old days, which, if you were honest, were mostly full of mud, fleas, and children screaming. And when the inevitable happened, when one spouse passed away, the survivor was honoured as a living treasure, a walking reminder of endurance, partnership, and the value of a good sense of humour. Grief was heavy, but so was gratitude. After all, you'd accomplished something most never did: growing old together, with someone who understood every joke, every sorrow, every victory, and every embarrassing moment along the way. So next time you see an old couple bickering on a park bench, think of your medieval ancestors. If you grew old together back then, you'd earned the right to grumble, snore, and claim the softest seat by the fire. In a world full of uncertainty, that was as close to a happy ending as anyone could ask for. You've heard of knights serenading ladies and writing poems by moonlight, but that wasn't your reality. Unless you were in the top 1% of medieval society, your love life involved fewer roses and more discussions about whose turn it was to clean the chamber pot. Courtly love was for the nobles. Real love was for whoever didn't steal your only pair of socks. Let's start with the fantasy. In the great castles and manors, poets and troubadours sang songs about impossible, passionate devotion. A knight kneeling in the moonlight, pledging to serve his lady with sword and sonnet, risking life and limb for a single silk handkerchief. Nobles sent secret letters, embroidered gifts, and sometimes even staged tournaments for love. There were rules to this game. Love was meant to be chaste, unattainable, and usually directed at someone you could never actually marry. It was emotional, dramatic, and, let's be honest, a bit theatrical. Everyone wanted to be Lancelot or Guinevere, as long as nobody had to deal with mud, chores, or the results of bad plumbing. Now let's contrast that with daily life for the other 99%. While the nobleman might spend the afternoon penning verses under a tapestry, you were out in the fields, ankle-deep in turnips and praying for a rain cloud. Romantic gestures, if they happened at all, were practical. A chunk of extra bread at supper, a patch sewn onto your shirt, or someone saving you the last bit of cheese. Nobody serenaded you from beneath your window, mainly because your house didn't have windows, and anyone lurking outside after dark was either a thief, a ghost, or an extremely optimistic neighbour. Real love in the medieval world wasn't about moonlit walks or whispered poetry. It was teamwork, carrying firewood together, chasing off stray pigs, and agreeing not to blame each other when the soup burned. affection was practical and subtle. A shared smile over a job well done, or a muttered joke while cleaning out the chicken coop, meant more than any rhyming couplet from a troubadour. For most people, marriage wasn't even about love to begin with. It was about survival, alliances, and, if you were lucky, mutual respect. Maybe love grew over time, as you weathered harvest failures and smallpox outbreaks together. Maybe it didn't, and you simply got used to each other, like a favourite mug that leaks but you can't bear to throw away. Either way, your romance happened in between chores, not in the great halls of a castle. Occasionally you'd catch wind of courtly love, usually when a travelling minstrel wandered through, spinning stories about lords and ladies who pined for each other across impossible distances. The village children might play at being princesses and knights, but most adults just rolled their eyes and got back to shoveling manure. Courtly love was entertainment, not instruction. Besides, the last thing you needed was someone composing sonnets when there were potatoes to plant. If you ever dared to dream of roses, those dreams were swiftly checked by reality. Roses had thorns, and any flower worth picking was probably needed for supper or medicine. Still, that didn't mean peasants and townsfolk didn't feel deep affection. Couples grew old together, raised children, laughed at life's absurdities, and sometimes even found moments of genuine tenderness in a world that was rarely gentle. So the next time you hear about knights and their lady loves, remember that medieval romance was mostly for those who could afford to be impractical. The rest of the world made do with what they had: a warm fire, a full belly, and someone willing to share both. And if you found a spouse who didn't complain, much, about your snoring, or who forgave you for forgetting to latch the goat pen, that was as close to a medieval fairy tale as most people ever got. Before the ceremony, everyone, and I mean everyone, had to watch you walk to church in a shuffling line of relatives, neighbours and livestock. Pipes played, banners waved, and the whole village turned up just to judge your outfit. It was less royal wedding, and more like being the main act in a parade nobody actually rehearsed for. Let's start at home, where your mother is frantically dusting you off with a wet rag, and your father is shouting for your siblings to stop arguing and try to look respectable for once. The air is thick with excitement and that special kind of dread that comes from knowing you're about to be the centre of attention. As you step outside, you're greeted by a crowd already gathering, some of whom you don't recognise, but who are definitely ready to comment on whether your tunic is new or just well mended. Medieval wedding processions weren't optional. The walk to the church was a public event, and the entire village took it as their personal responsibility to show up, walk along, and loudly critique everything from your posture to your mother's best attempt at braiding your hair. The atmosphere is somewhere between carnival and critical family reunion. Children run underfoot, geese honk, and at least one neighbour has brought a suspiciously large drum. Music is required, of course. The local piper, who practices exactly once a year for this occasion, leads the way with a tune that's only slightly off-key and just repetitive enough to haunt your dreams for months. Someone else tries to keep rhythm with a tambourine, but quickly gives up and just shakes it every time someone steps in mud. If your family's feeling ambitious, there might even be a homemade banner, decorated with whatever scraps of cloth survive the winter, and a faded drawing of something that's either a lion or a very angry cow. And then there's the dancing. Every medieval wedding procession had at least one person, usually your cousin, often the village jokester, who was determined to turn the simple act of walking to church into an interpretive dance marathon. He spins, leaps, and generally causes a commotion, dragging anyone within arm's reach into the spectacle. If you're lucky, he only knocks over one or two chickens. If you're unlucky, someone ends up with a sprained ankle before you even get to the churchyard. Don't forget the livestock. Animals were part of the show, whether you liked it or not. The best goat festooned with flowers and chewing on someone's bouquet brings up the rear. A neighbour's cow, roped into service as honorary witness, leaves a trail that will be the talk of the feast later. Dogs bark, cats scatter, and there's always a collective groan when the piglets make a break for the vegetable patch. The procession was more than just a noisy stroll. It was an announcement to the world that something big was happening. It made the event official, involved the whole community, and served as the medieval equivalent of posting 100 photos online. Except there was no deleting the embarrassing bits. If someone tripped or a relative's hat blew off, the story would be retold for years. As you reach the church, the crowd clusters at the entrance, still talking, still judging, and still making sure every detail is noted for tomorrow's gossip. The piper plays one last, slightly triumphant or just relieved note, and the banner is tucked away until the next big event. The livestock are ushered to the side, hopefully, and everyone squeezes into the pews, ready for the main event. So next time you hear about a medieval wedding, remember, before the vows, before the feast, and before the dancing really got out of hand, there was the procession, a parade that celebrated, scrutinized, and set the tone for the entire day. It wasn't private or perfect, but it was uniquely medieval, chaotic, joyful, and unforgettable, with a lingering soundtrack of pipes, laughter, and the world's most persistent dancer. Forget fondue sets and toasters. Medieval wedding gifts were practical, mysterious, and occasionally alive. Guests brought cheese, chickens, rough cloth, or the odd kitchen tool. If you were lucky, you got a blanket. If you were unlucky, you got 3 more mouths to feed and a wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel. In the Middle Ages, wedding gifts weren't about matching your new curtains or impressing your Instagram followers. They were about helping a young couple survive, preferably until next harvest. As you and your new spouse greeted your line of guests, you quickly realized that every present carried a story, a suggestion, or an obligation. Aunt Mildred's massive cheese wheel. "It'll last you through the winter," she says, as everyone quietly prays it lasts through next week. "That flock of chickens from your father's cousin? Wonderful, if you can keep them from moving in with you and your in-laws." The most common gifts were things you needed, not things you wanted. Cheese was a universal crowd pleaser, especially a good, hard wheel that could survive months in a cool cellar. It doubled as food, dowry asset, and occasionally a last-ditch weapon against rowdy neighbours. Blankets, though precious, were even better. No one ever complained about too many blankets, especially after a cold, wet winter. But then there were the living gifts. Chickens, goats, piglets, or even a stray cat. These were equal parts blessing and curse. On a good day, your flock provided eggs, milk, or entertainment as they chased off mice. On a bad day, the animals broke loose and ate your only cabbage, or tried to sleep in your marital bed. If you lived in a small house, congratulations, you now lived in a smaller, noisier house, with more cleaning required. Every gift animal came with the expectation that you would do the same for the next wedding in the village, so your own chicken population became a sort of living wedding registry in constant rotation. Other gifts were practical. A set of wooden spoons, a battered iron pot, a patchwork tablecloth, or the ever-popular bundle of good, rough cloth. Cloth was currency, and everyone could use more. Of course, you could also receive a tangle of yarn that your spouse's great-aunt insisted would become a lovely scarf, if you ever get around to it. If your friends were feeling especially generous, they might show up with a wheelbarrow or a shovel, though if the wheel wobbled or the handle was cracked, you'd spend the next year cursing their thoughtfulness. For the lucky, a few coins might come your way, though money was rare and usually reserved for those with serious means to spare. More often, the coins were given with a speech about responsibility and the importance of not wasting it all at the next village fair. Spoiler, at least one groom did, and never heard the end of it. Not every gift was a winner. Sometimes a neighbour unloaded an extra child. He's good at chasing chickens, or offered you an heirloom that was just a broken jug with a colourful story attached. The social pressure to accept and feign delight was immense. Turning down a gift was the fastest way to insult a family and start a multi-generational grudge. Unwrapping wasn't a thing. Every present was revealed and judged by the entire crowd. Givers offered explanations, advice, and sometimes veiled threats about how to care for the gift. "That goat likes to wander, but she's clever" meant If she destroys your garden, don't say I didn't warn you. The joy was real, but so was the anxiety. Would the cheese mould? Would the pot leak? Would the chickens make it to sunrise? Still, there was real meaning in every bundle. Your community was rooting for you, or at least betting on you. Gifts represented shared hope, shared burdens, and the knowledge that surviving marriage in medieval Europe took more than love. It took chickens, cheese, and a blanket or two. So next time you eye a wedding registry and roll your eyes at the 9th set of towels, just remember, things could be worse. At least nobody handed you a goat and a wobbly wheelbarrow in front of the whole town. So you made it. You survived the awkward dances, the dowry negotiations, the itchy wedding tunics, and at least one meal where you weren't totally sure if that was cheese or just very confident butter. You weathered in-laws, public bedding ceremonies, and the romantic thrill of sharing a straw mattress with someone whose main virtue was not currently coughing up plague. That, my friend, is what we call medieval marriage. Tonight, as you settle into your clean, comfortable bed, one blessedly free of fleas, turnips, or goats, maybe take a quiet moment to appreciate just how far we've come. Your house isn't stuffed with livestock for warmth. Your most stressful wedding memory probably doesn't involve a parish priest making sure you were really married. And when you argue over chores, at least you're not patching a thatched roof or fighting over who has to chase the chickens out of the kitchen. Remember, those who came before us didn't just survive. They coped, they laughed, they built families in the face of impossible odds, and they got through days when all you had to look forward to was slightly less mouldy bread and a prayer that the neighbour's cow wouldn't eat your laundry. It wasn't always fair or easy or even remotely romantic, but it was life, and somehow they made it work. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in, maybe whisper a little thank you to the medieval couples who made it through lice, leprosy, and the world's most public wedding nights. Because if they could find love, or at least tolerable companionship, through all that, then hey, you're doing just fine. Sleep well. The past was messy, but at least you get to dream in peace. Good night.